Honor to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. Brett McGurk. He is a public servant who has advised the last 4 presidents, and he is one of the critical U.S. foreign policy actors of his generation. In his position as the White House's top Middle East negotiator, he acted as an intermediary, negotiating multiple hostage releases, forging international partnerships, and engaging with leaders across the Middle East. Before I continue introducing him, I want to mention that we are also fortunate to have Stephen Simon here to serve as his discussant. Mr. Simon also served on the National Security Council and in senior positions at the U.S. Department of State, and he has published widely in press and periodicals, including his recent book, Grand Delusion: The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East, which was named a Best Book of 2023 by The New Yorker and Financial Times. And he is now a visiting professor at Dartmouth. But now a bit more about our keynote speaker. Brett McGurk served as a diplomat in Baghdad, helping to structure the legal framework for elections and participating in the promulgation of Iraq's interim constitution. He went on to serve as special assistant to the president and senior director for Iraq and Afghanistan under President Bush, and he was a chief architect of the surge that transformed U.S. strategy in the Iraq War, aiming to protect the local population while promoting democratic self-government. Under President Obama, he served as the senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs with a focus on Iraq and Iran. He spearheaded bilateral negotiations with Iran that led to the release of 6 U.S. citizens from the Evin prison, and he also played a key role in negotiating with Russia over the Syrian crisis. He worked closely with local forces on the ground against ISIS while serving as special presidential envoy under both President Obama and President Trump. And most recently, under the Biden administration, Mr. McGurk managed the U.S. responses to the regional crisis and war that followed the Hamas attacks against Israel on October 7th, 2023. He was the lead negotiator on the Gaza ceasefire and hostage release talks, which culminated in a successful agreement on January 19th, 2025. And over the more than 2 months that it lasted, dozens of hostages were released, and more than 2 million Gazans received critical humanitarian and food aid. It marked the longest cessation of hostilities since the latest outbreak of war. As a vital player in the 4 administrations that he has advised, Brett McGurk has faced some of the most challenging obstacles to implementing democracy. And the title of his talk today is The Pitfalls of Maximalist Aims, a first-hand account of democracy promotion in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Brett McGurk.
Thank you so much, everybody, for having me, and thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to be here. When you called me to do this, I was just out of the administration and thought seriously about how to even broach this topic. The panels before me, I think, give a pretty broad breadth, but also why I chose and what you'll hear is really my firsthand account. I approach this as a practitioner. And what I aim to offer is experience over 2 decades of American history as a participant, for better or worse, in the arena, from the corridors of Washington to the battlefields in Iraq, Syria, capitals across the Middle East region around the world. And in doing so, I'll aim to draw some hard lessons and then open up the session to questions from a good friend of mine, from Steve. So let me start a little over 2 decades ago with an event that hasn't been discussed yet here, but I think is very relevant. And that was an early challenge to our own democracy in this century. And that was Bush versus Gore. And why start there? Well, that was a case that asked the Supreme Court back in 2000 to basically stop ongoing recounts in Florida. And the Supreme Court ruled and effectively handed the presidency to George W. Bush, as many of you will remember, but not all of you. And more importantly for these remarks, it's where my story starts, because less than 6 months later, after that decision, I began a clerkship at the Supreme Court for Chief Justice Rehnquist at the time, who had just sided with the majority. So this is the summer of 2001. The Supreme Court at that time, to me, I was a young, bright-eyed lawyer. I had come from public schools in Connecticut. I went to UConn undergrad. I went to law school at Columbia. At the Supreme Court, felt like the center of the universe. And I dug into the work and the papers, and I learned about the Bush v. Gore case and how it was decided. At the time, it was just kind of everything that I had been studying. There you are. And it was exhilarating, fascinating. It also seems quaint now, but this was also a time, the summer of 2001, of intense political divisions. At least that's how I remembered it at the time. Law clerks from the term before me who were on their way out were in pitched camps, and they seemed to never even want to see each other again. But whatever one may have thought about that decision, Bush v. Gore at the time, the court had ruled, and based on the traditions of the rule of law that we've heard throughout the day here, in our country, the principle of judicial review dating back to Marbury versus Madison, which we've heard about, there was no serious questioning of it. The challenges were over. The court decided George W. Bush was president. That was kind of that. And I don't think I appreciated at the time just how precious that principle that we're talking about here today, the rule of law, not the rule of raw power, the rule of institutions and a constitution and traditions of democracy formed over 2 centuries truly was. So on the morning of September 11th, 2001, I walked to the Supreme Court from my apartment at the time, about a mile up Capitol Hill. And I remember that morning vividly, as I think anyone who lived through that day remembers it quite vividly. There were spectacular blue skies. It was perfect fall temperatures. I walked into the Supreme Court. We met the Chief Justice in his chambers, as we did every morning at 9 o'clock. And he told us he had just seen news that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. And we assumed at the moment it was a tragic accident, maybe a small commuter plane. Mind you, offices in the Supreme Court at that time had no internet service, not really cell phones, certainly no smartphones. And I returned to my office to get back to work, and U.S. Marshals came sprinting. My office was just next to the Chief Justice's chambers. And U.S. Marshals came darting down the hallway and running into his office. I remember their handcuffs and keys jangling, and I kind of still remember that sound at that moment. And I left my office, I followed them in, and they told the chief that America was under attack. That actually 2 commercial jetliners had hit the towers, another had hit the Pentagon, and more planes were in the air heading for, they speculated, the White House, the Capitol, maybe the court. Nobody knew. I was ushered out the back of the building, sprinting out the back of the building. We were directed to flee towards Union Station, and we were walking towards Union Station. And I was looking over my left shoulder in the blue sky, and there was black smoke wafting through the sky from the Pentagon, and expecting to see a plane coming for the Capitol. I'll never forget that. So America is now at war, and my country and my life would never be the same. I'm surprised by the panels that this moment, this definitive event that many of us lived through, was not kind of marked as a bit of a turning point. Certainly a turning point in my life, and I think in our country's life. In any case, I finished my clerkship. I went into private practice for a little bit, but I was restless with the churn of legal work, not finding it as exciting as I had before 9/11, and I wanted to do something more to serve. And I was closely following the national debates at the time. I was reading everything I could about terrorism and paths to political violence and extremism. I tended to agree with those that argued at the time that a root cause of the terrorism that had just reached our shores actually stemmed from a lack of democracy in the Middle East region. That argument went like this. Middle East governments, including the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, might not have had anything to do with 9/11, but the roots of extremism, that these dictators held power only by brute force, and to do so, they deflected the anger and the frustration and the anomie of their own populations away from themselves and towards us, towards the West, towards the United States. So we were the scapegoats for the dictators like Saddam Hussein or Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran or the Taliban, who held power not with the consent of their population, but through ruthless and brutal oppression. Thus, to protect ourselves and dry up the conditions from which terrorism arose, the United States, this is the argument went at the time, Go pick up The Economist from fall of 2001. This is the argument. We should embark on opening up these societies and establishing democratic systems where authoritarianism had been the norm for decades, if not centuries. And analogies were made at the time to World War II, where Germany and Japan, after the bloodiest war in history, became allies in constitutional democracies. Therefore, after 9/11, America, again, we had a right and even an obligation to protect ourselves by making more people freer under democratic systems. Democracies do not attack democracies. Core argument at the time, and enough was enough. Frankly, I found that argument compelling. And why should people in Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan not enjoy the same freedoms and opportunities that we enjoy here? And if the governments of those countries chose to harness their people to be committed enemies of ours, then those governments placed themselves in our crosshairs. This was not an outlier argument, as I mentioned. John McCain, we heard about the Munich Security Conference just now, but John McCain at the Munich Security Conference, but even before the Iraq War began, it's in 2002, quote, John McCain, "Today, the free people of Europe and America turn our attention to lands where freedom's absence not only offends our values, I think we can all agree we want more democracies in the world, but imperils our security." So it's a key argument. This is kind of an underwriting driver of the Iraq War, separate from WMD, and if you followed the debates at the time. So fast forward to the fall of 2003. It's about 6 months after America's invasion of Iraq. I received a call in my law office that changed my life forever, and is probably the only reason anyone would want to hear me speak today, because had it not come, I'd probably have just been a lawyer. It would have been a very different life. But on the other line was a friend of mine who was serving in the Bush administration. He said he had just been in a meeting talking about Iraq, and the topic was the constitutional process, and they needed more people in Iraq who kind of knew about constitutions and could maybe advise the Iraqis who were then embarked on writing one. And he asked if I'd put my hat in the ring for such a job. In any case, shortly thereafter, in January 2004, I landed in Baghdad. Again, I was a lawyer. I had no security clearance. I was sent to work on the legal structure. And I landed in Baghdad in the middle of a war zone. It was freezing cold. I did not expect that at the time. I remember my bags were thrown off a military cargo plane into a puddle. It was raining. It was not a great start. In any case, I was directed into a vehicle with some other military lawyers who were there to take me to my office. And we soon sped out the airport complex onto a road where the driver said this road is known as the highway of death due to the attacks on the road every day, suicide bombs and snipers, and hulks of burnt out vehicles were lining the road as we swerved through traffic. And it was the most harrowing ride of my life, but also left a visceral, very early impression that our campaign in Iraq, no matter how well intended, may not have been going very well. And we had not even secured the road to the airport. We arrived at the palace that was then the headquarters for the Coalition Provisional Authority, known as CPA. We were the occupying power in Iraq. The United States and our few coalition partners were the occupying authority in Iraq. And mind you, I have to remind you, sometimes histories have been written that I have been at the right seat of everything that's happened. I had nothing to do with decision to invade Iraq, dissolving the Iraqi army, all this stuff that happened till this point. But I was there to try to address some of the consequences of those decisions. Now, the CPA, which I was now working for, had authorities under a UN Security Council resolution to work with Iraqis along a timeline for a political transition to a democracy. And that transition had 5 steps. First, to draft an interim constitution. Second, to then establish an interim government under that interim text. Third, to elect a new parliament to draft a permanent constitution. Fourth, hold a national referendum to ratify that constitution. And finally, to hold elections for a new government under the new constitution. Mr. Prime Minister, probably similar to what you worked on in Tunisia. So that was the path that had been developed to set up a constitutional democracy in Iraq, and it really was not a bad one. The process would take about a year, underwritten by U.S. military forces helping to train Iraqis, provide basic security in the country. But the fatal flaw in this plan was that there really was no security in Iraq. And rockets would pour down on what was then known as the Green Zone. Trips around Baghdad became impossible. Colleagues of mine on trips got ambushed. The insurgency in the country growing stronger. More Iraqis and Americans were dying every week. And the assumption underlying American policy at the time, as I would later learn once I took on more senior positions, was that the worsening security was due to the lack of political progress, and therefore by focusing on the political progress, this transition I mentioned, we would ultimately resolve the security problem. That was the whole theory of the driving theory of the policy. My job was to focus on that political process, and that's what we did. We drafted an interim constitution. About 6 months after I landed, we dissolved the CPA altogether. An interim Iraqi government took charge of basic decisions. But unfortunately, with every milestone we hit, the security problem actually got worse, not better. The entire assumption underlying our policy, that worsening security was a byproduct of political discord, and thus to get a handle on the security crisis, we needed more political progress, was flawed. But it was never seriously questioned because there was always another political milestone around the corner, and that might be the one that finally would turn the corner. Summer of 2005, I started a new position in the White House at the National Security Council, again focused on the Iraq crisis. And on paper at this time, things seemed to be going okay. The Iraqis completed a permanent constitution. They endorsed it in a national referendum. The political transition had moved just as we had outlined over a year earlier. And now we were at the ultimate step, a national election under the new constitution for a new government. And that election was actually a huge success with high turnout across the country. But it then took months to form a new government. And in the interim, a terrorist group known then as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, later rebranded as ISIS years later, destroyed a Shia mosque and unleashed a torrent of sectarian violence. This is in 2006. Hundreds of Iraqis are now dying every day just in the capital of Baghdad. U.S. troops, far too few and overstretched, were caught in the middle. And mind you, this was after the whole political process I'd outlined had succeeded. We'd kind of reached the end of that timeline. From inside the White House, I became a vocal critic of our war strategy. And working in White Houses, it is actually not easy to be actually stand up in the Oval Office Situation Room and say this is actually not working. But a few of us did. If you read Bush's memoir, Decision Points, he mentions me and a few others at this time he called us a kind of band of brothers, like really trying to drive a change in what we were doing. But I believe we had the assumption backwards, in that without security, and Spencer mentioned this earlier, without security, and that meant more security resources, and that would mean more American troops, which nobody at the time wanted to talk about, there would never be political progress, because politics, the give and take of democracy, cannot succeed or take root when people are focused on just their own survival. So this led to a reversal of the policy that had been in place since the start of the war, a surge of 30,000 additional American troops, beginning in early 2007, and with a new mission to secure the population, as Jonathan mentioned in introducing me. So American strategy now recognized for the first time that without prioritizing basic security needs, there was no serious hope of political progress. But now let me step back and return to the theme of this symposium, because those who advocate for policies to democratize the Middle East region, and what I'm talking about here is an assertive American policy, different than organic movements, but assertive American policy to support democratization. Presuming it's in our power and interest to do so, those who advocate for that point to Iraq not as a supportive example, but as a blunder. But you can't have it both ways, because it's in Iraq where the United States did invest decades, billions of dollars, over 4,000 lives to support the development of a democracy in the Middle East. So pointing to Iraq as misbegotten while otherwise supporting grand ambitions to advance democracy elsewhere, I think presumes with no empirical evidence that we might achieve more with less. And that logic fails to heed what I think is the most important lesson of all from the Iraq experience. If any of you are involved in foreign policy, students, or down the road, this is the core lesson to me. And it goes to any policy. in foreign affairs, the debilitating mismatch from the start between ends, ways, and means. And the alignment of ends, ways, and means is just the essence of strategy in human affairs. And in foreign policy, it's inside that gap between ends and means that folly lies. That's what I've experienced as an iron law. And it's often unheeded to the peril of leaders and nations. So just to the lesson, think about this. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003, which I later dealt with a force of 130,000 troops, very few allies, and a maximalist, nearly infinite aim to overthrow a dictatorship and establish a constitutional democracy. Just by way of comparison, the 1991 Gulf War, there was over 450,000 American troops in that military operation, a coalition of 35 countries, and a far more limited objective: you get Iraq out of Kuwait and reinstall the Kuwaiti monarchy. So 1991 Gulf War, limited, well-defined ends, nearly 4 times the means. 2003 invasion of Iraq, maximalist ends, 1/4 of the means. It's a core lesson and something we got fundamentally wrong. And yet, after 2 decades, despite the mistakes from the start, one might argue that this maximalist goal was met. And that's why Dr. El-Shamri's point was actually very compelling to me, and not one I hear all the time. Because few might defend Iraq as a model democracy, but we're talking about the Middle East here. And compared to, you have to ask, compared to what? Iraq has now had 5 national elections, 6 peaceful transitions of power. It's set to hold its 6th national election later this year. It's the only Arab state really in the region. No offense to Tunisia, but I'm talking about right now. The election is not predetermined. The country's overcome massive challenges, including ISIS, pernicious pressure from Iran. I think Iran has not been mentioned enough when it comes to some of the challenges here. While retaining its constitutional structure, debating big questions of resource allocation, interpretation of Islam and democratic values, through a political process, albeit frankly with outcomes that might enrage one constituency or another in the country, or many in Washington, as was also mentioned at the last panel. But it is a democracy. No doubt the country's rife for problems, but there's no sign of Iraq backsliding on elections or the basic premise that the country must be governed under a democratic constitution. So, for those who believe American policy should focus or emphasize on democratization in the Middle East, why not point to Iraq today as an example, a positive example? I think the answer is the cost. And few today would justify the cost in American lives and dollars and treasure for the Iraq we see today, and it's something I frankly struggle with myself. And the lesson I've drawn after a lot of thought is not that we should do more in terms of promoting democracy with far less. There lies the folly of the iron law I mentioned, but rather that we should focus on more realistic proximate aims within our reach and influence and within our means, and tied a little more directly to the national security interests of our country. We simply do not have the capacity, the attention span at acceptable cost to take on projects of determining whether any given country should have a more democratic system of government, let alone trying to implement such grand designs in the most complex region, one of the most complex regions of the world. You might counter that Iraq is an outlier example. So let's not draw conclusions about the efficacy of American-led democratization based on the Iraq experience, but let's consider some other examples. I'll do it very briefly so we can get to questions. But Libya, the United States and NATO embarked on a military campaign to remove the Gaddafi regime. There have been multiple UN Security Council resolutions calling for elections. To date, there have been no elections. The country is effectively divided in half. At one point, it was a stronghold for ISIS in North Africa. It's fed instability in Tunisia, into southern Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. Syria's been mentioned. In 2011, the United States declared the maximalist goal of regime change in Syria, but without anywhere near the commitment given to Libya or Iraq, as there was never any real support in Washington for military intervention other than for the limited objective of defeating ISIS. We back various factions of one persuasion or another against a regime backed very heavily by Russia and Iran. Perhaps we should have done more. That really was not in the cards. In any event, it was a policy that violated that iron law I mentioned. So now 10 years later, more than 10 years later, 10 years after the UN Security Council resolution calling for elections and a political transition. And yet that really has gone nowhere. And even after the Assad regime has fallen, with the rebel advance led by al-Shara, who was mentioned, the former leader of al-Qaeda in Syria, talk about unintended consequences, that new system, new government has rejected that transition formula put together by the UN. But I happen to still believe that we should help this new Syria succeed. That means waiving sanctions as the system matures, maintaining our secure military presence in northeast Syria is quite important, trying to do what we can to ensure the protection of minorities. But whether or not Syria becomes a flourishing democracy at the end of the day is something that Syrians must and ultimately will determine. I'll offer one final example, and Peter, you mentioned it in the questions, but that's where Washington did support and endorse a democratic election, but with just massive unintended consequences that we're now very much still dealing with, and that's Gaza. I was not involved at the time, but I was certainly involved in some of the consequences years later, which I'm happy to discuss in the question and answer. But in 2005, Israel pulled out of Gaza entirely. All its troops, even exhumed as dead, gone, out. Around the same time, Gaza held elections, and Hamas, that was just discussed, won, and later consolidated power in an armed struggle with the Palestinian Authority. In my view, looking back, Washington probably should not have supported an election in which Hamas was a main party running, did not sign up to the PLO principles determined by its own charter for the destruction of Israel. Because so long as Hamas is ruling Gaza, there's just never any hope for a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or any hope for a serious reconstruction of Gaza with the international backing that is required. So again, for those who advocate democracy promotion, U.S.-led democracy promotion as a fundamental tenet for Middle East policy, it's another example where a democratic election led not to better outcomes for anyone, but in my view, a catastrophe for the region and for the Palestinian people those elections were meant to serve. But let me conclude and look ahead on a far less despairing note, because I very much agree with what was the theme of this last panel. The lessons of strategy that I'm talking about, the iron law, ends, ways, and means, should not invite paralysis, but just rigor in defining our interests and our objectives. And the Middle East today may not be a path to achieve the maximalist aims that shaped the foreign policy debate before the Iraq War, but there are trends of potential and promise that I think we can and should support, and particularly by bolstering security partnerships and deterring broader conflicts, because that fundamental element of security. But if you look around today, the Assad regime in Syria is gone, and a new system is emerging, and it's one that offers some hope after so much destruction and conflict. Hezbollah in Syria is defeated. I think that's a good thing. We can talk about the Lebanon war, but Hezbollah being on its back foot ultimately I think is good, and Lebanon is now finally has a fully sovereign government with a president asserting its own independence and sovereignty. There's some real opportunity there. Iran, which I mentioned, and I think warrants more mention, we were talking about trends of democratization in the region, but its revolutionary system that stokes chaos across the region, it's in its weakest position in decades. Its youthful population, led by women, is rejecting the system altogether. Something, again, I think we should support. The Gulf is undergoing this extraordinary liberalizing economic trend that's also translating to more rights, opportunities for individuals, particularly women. Iraq, as has been mentioned, generally stable, preparing for elections later this year. I could go on. There's visions of broader integration, things that we talked about in the Biden administration, the Trump administration has picked up. All trends that we can, I think, encourage and nudge with proximate aims pursued through an active diplomatic presence and a sustained military footprint, which is necessary, air, land, and sea. They do not require interventionist policies of regime change or declared aims of establishing democratic systems. After all, I think, is democracy ever effectively advanced through an aggressive American policy of such grandiose objectives? And probably not. Countries like South Korea or Philippines did not emerge from authoritarianism to democratic systems by an American or else. It emerged over a security umbrella, which allowed those systems to develop over time, time being key. And without security, again, there is nothing. So in the Middle East, by supporting the trends I just highlighted, remaining present, engaged, militarily, diplomatically, deterring aggression from Iran, or from ISIS or Al-Qaeda. That's how moderate trends emerge and extremists lose over time. I think it'd be the wrong lesson to give up altogether or to withdraw support from long-term partners simply because they may not today adhere to democratic values, which have been established here over centuries. After all, in America, neither present nor engaged only ensures a vacuum to be filled by extremist non-state actors or revisionist authoritarian states like China, Russia, Iran. It's an outcome against any agenda to promote liberal values. So that may not be called democracy promotion, but it's probably the only plausible path for promoting the ingredients of democracy, whether in the Middle East or anywhere else over time. So thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take your questions.
Situation because it's an odd situation because I haven't turned the mic on. There we go. Nice. I'm broadly sympathetic to the thrust of your remarks. We're twins separated at birth, that kind of thing. But it's my job to challenge you. So in a sense, I have to betray my own impulses and preferences and ideological predispositions to put you on the spot. Not an easy thing to do, really, psychologically or as a practical matter. But I want to go back to something that you said at the end of your remarks, which was your gesture of optimism, hope, that there's room for democracy promotion, and in fact there are possibilities for democratic transitions in the region, something that we all want to hear. So that's great. Now, I want to juxtapose that with your first, I think your first foray as I forget what your title was, special coordinator or something.
On what?
Your title under Biden.
Coordinator, yeah.
Coordinator, yeah. You gave us a speech at, I think it was the Washington Institute, which is a Washington, Beltway operation that's favored by some degree people on the right and people who favor a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship. And so you sketched out, I thought, really well, in architectural terms, really, what U.S. policy under Biden would be in the region. And you reprised some of those points, actually, in your remarks today, putting the emphasis on security partnerships and so forth. But in that entire speech, there was not one word derived from the Greek stem demos. Nothing. Which sort of suggested that, from the get-go, democratization as an objective of U.S. policy, even a derivative objective of U.S. policy, was sort of, passé. It wasn't worth mentioning, as it were. So I thought it might be useful to ask you about how you look back on that moment against your views right now about possibilities for democratization.
Thanks, Steve. Fair question. I think that speech was at the Atlantic Council, but in any case, I don't think American policy should be focused on democracy promotion in the Middle East. And to put that as our objective, it leads to all sorts of problems. I think there's no efficacy in it. So I think, I have to go back to that speech, but I think the point we were making was kind of a return to pragmatism and a bit of realism, but with a recognition that we need to be engaged in this region. And so Tunisia is a good example. Tunisia is a backsliding democracy, and I was there for Qais Said when he basically seized power. What does America do in that situation? We have a military relationship with Tunisia. We have an economic relationship with Tunisia. China is actively courting Tunisia. If you're driving in Tunis, there's the, correct me, but there's the diplomatic training center built by China. Okay. Is it in our interest to say, man, this country is going the wrong way, so we're going to... Just the building, okay. But still, you notice, it's not... to say... But look, there's ports, there's all sorts of strategic... To say, if you're in a job like mine in the White House, you know what, this country's going in a backsliding democratic track. We're going to cut economic assistance. We're going to cut military assistance. That's like a very difficult question. And in my view, I do think we are in a massive competition with China and Russia in the Middle East, a little less so with Russia now, certainly with China. And I do think we have to be very clear and cold about what that means. And that means our relationships with countries that are not democracies are still fundamentally important to our national interests. And I don't put that as a goal for the United States policy. But as I mentioned, Philippines and South Korea, I'm not an expert in those countries, but we had a security commitment, a treaty commitment, and over time and decades, that security umbrella produces results that are not only in our national security interests, but also in the interests of more liberal trends and moderation. And that's another reason I think we have to have those types of policies in the region. But yeah, I would not put the democracy as a core goal for our U.S. policy in the Middle East.
So let's look back on Iraq for a moment, because your account there was extremely interesting in the way that you presented a choice for an occupying power, like the United States was in that circumstance, between ensuring security as a means of ultimately stabilizing the politics, or trying to stabilize the politics and subordinating that goal, rather subordinating security to that goal. Okay, and I was struck by the way you framed that, because it seemed to me to be something of a false choice, even in the case of Iraq. So, and I mean that in two ways. The first, the more general way, is that even the United States, generally speaking, can walk and chew gum at the same time. And there would presumably have been a way to synchronize our efforts to ensure security and promote political development and stability. But in your framing, it seemed as though that really wasn't an option. Now, my instinct would be to say, actually, we never really had the option of stabilizing politics because of the way in which the United States had approached Iraq to begin with, which was to decapitate it and eviscerate all of its administrative capacity essentially in an instant. And that pushed Iraq in the direction of Iraqis in the direction of seeking shelter under sectarian flags and sectarian warlords, and so forth. And once that process was underway, then U.S. efforts to stabilize Iraq from a security perspective were going to be seriously challenged. On the question of the number of troops involved and how that played into American incapacity to get a grip on the security situation, I'm not so sure I agree with that. Now, of course, I wasn't there, so just give me the benefit of the doubt while I sketch out the argument. You could argue that 150,000 troops or so that the United States had in Iraq at that time would have sufficed to stabilize the country if they had been used differently than the way that they were used. And I'm thinking back, excuse me, my mouth is really dry. I'm thinking back to sort of the Casey formula, General George Casey's formula for governing Iraq, or for stabilizing Iraq from a security perspective, and then later on, David Petraeus's approach. The addition of 30,000 troops at the height of the surge to the U.S. End strength in Iran at the time, in Iraq at the time, was not, a huge plus up considering the size of the problem. It was really a question of using troops differently than they had been used. So I guess the question I'm asking you is whether the trade-off, the massive trade-off between security first and democracy first, was really somehow ontological, or whether the balance between those two values, those two goods, could have been struck in ways that would have led to a different outcome.
I mean, it's a big question, which would limited time, but you look at when Don Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, that period, and then afterwards. That's a key distinction. Not only more resources, but in how those troops were used. So I don't take issue with what you said. I mean, there's a fundamental question of whether Iraq, in our experience there, was a failure of conception, meaning the entire conception of invading, toppling a dictatorship, establishing democracy, or execution. We could have done something different. We could have had a division come out of Turkey. We tried that. We almost had that. Could have had more forces at the beginning. But also, to your point, yes, we should. A very different approach was taken with the surge. Not just more resources, but we're going to have forces in the population centers with a population security mission, which is hugely controversial to do. Petraeus supported it. He became the commander, but writ large within the Pentagon at the time, that was not something that anybody really wanted to do. But it was, we had pockets where we knew it could work. So it was a more resources allocation, but also a very different military mission, fundamentally different. And it's not a total I mean, you need that basic security to allow the political system to mature and allow the host nation security forces to have the confidence to secure their own population, which eventually I think took hold. Now, we then had a lot of history since then, but I think the ability of the Iraqis to basically hold the line even after ISIS and be able to recover from that was, a byproduct, the foundation I do think was set during that surge period.
Yeah. I guess the point I was veering toward was just really a bit more maybe the advisability of some caution about the trade-offs involved between security and democratization in these kinds of stabilization operations. Now, I'm skeptical that there will ever be such an operation, at least in my lifetime, so let's say within the next 10 minutes. But seriously, could be decades before there's a revamping of American security policy in a way that would turn democratization once again into an objective for U.S. policy. But I'd argue that that was already the case in the wake of Iraq, and certainly by the beginning of Obama's administration. There wasn't all that much interest in pursuing democratization anywhere, and the same attitude, I think, prevailed once the Arab Spring was underway. And I was quite struck by that. Very shortly after the transition in Tunisia, I went out to to Tunis with Secretary Clinton, as sort of the White House hanger-on, in the delegation. And what I was impressed was, what impressed me was that we had so little to offer the Tunisians. I mean, just about nothing. And I thought it was really rather brave of Hillary Clinton to walk in there and, hold out the interiors of her pockets and say, well, I'm sorry, but we can put in a good word for you at the World Bank. We can do that. I can find time for a call here. But as a practical matter, we had no resources, particularly for problems that for the transitional government were extremely pressing, particularly housing, for young people. There was a crisis I don't have to tell you that, obviously, but there was a crisis in Tunisia on that score, and the United States really could contribute nothing. And that sort of leads me to another question, which is, how much did the failure of U.S. democratization initiatives during this period, especially the Arab Spring, owe to the fact that Congress would not appropriate funds for the support of transitions, such that the United States might have been able to at least give the transitional governments a bit of a heads up?
You were there, so I'd have to ask you about that question. If you had more money, would it have led to a better transition? Maybe, but it's just so dynamic and complex, and the idea that some program out of our embassy might have, I'm skeptical. It doesn't mean you shouldn't invest in it and shouldn't have programs like Radio Free Asia or whatever it is. But the overall efficacy, I mean, these things have such a local character. Americans come in and out of these embassies every year. We rotate in and out. And so I am skeptical of our ability to have a kind of a linear process that can really kind of help lead a country if the organic factors aren't there. And I think the Prime Minister is very, honest about some mistakes they made about a constitutional process went on for 2 years that led to the disgruntlement of those who had led the revolution. I think those kind of factors, I think, are far more important than whether or not we have a well-funded USAID program.
So I would like to take this opportunity to open the conversation to those assembled here. So if anybody would like to add their question or comment to this conversation, we have a microphone here, which Sam will pass to you. I'm going to go first to Professor Guy Biner.
Thank you for that. I'm not entirely convinced or persuaded that America ever really was fully committed to promoting democracy in the Middle East, but we'll put that aside. I mean, it was committed. Whether it was fully committed, whether it was the real goal, I'm not persuaded. But looking at it now, I would definitely say that the current administration, that's no longer a goal of the current administration. Therefore, I wanted to ask, looking back, so what do we lose from that? What would we change from no longer being officially, in the rhetoric, committed to promoting democracy? Does that change policy in a significant way if we take that bit of rhetoric away?
I think I'd agree with Steve. I don't think it has been a driving force of our Middle East policy for some time across administrations. I think we have to be honest about that, and I frankly think for good reason, for the reasons I laid out. I think our ability to effectuate something like that, particularly with all the problems we're undergoing here, which were discussed in some of the earlier panels, I am quite skeptical as someone who's seen it quite up close. So I guess the answer I would give is no.
Professor Angie Piccone on that side.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. So I'll stand up because I'm short. So I come from a different part of the world, from Latin America, and given the title of this talk, of the symposium, what do you think are the lessons learned in the Middle East that can inform policy in other parts of the world in advancing or trying to promote the necessary steps so that we have democratic futures in places like Latin America or other parts of the world?
I would not support invading a country and trying to reform and create a whole new system. Look, I'm a believer in long-term American engagement, consistent, persistent, pays long-term dividends. And one thing I've learned in being across 4 administrations is just how short 4 years are to most countries around the world, especially in the Middle East. Right now, it's all Trump, but like the world might look very different 4 years from now, and a lot of the leaders we deal with know in 4 years you could be dealing with a completely different system. I think what has made the practice of foreign policy so difficult in this era that I talked about is that our changes have been so massive. So for George W. Bush to Obama, to Trump, to Biden, to Trump, it's like such a whiplash effect. And I hope we could get back to some sense of that term, the Overton window, is used to. you have kind of a window of foreign policy that more or less we're operating in. Sometimes it has to be shifted one way or the other, but we've kind of lost that. So it makes it hard, I think, to have any predictability. But anyway, I would just hope the answer is engagement, partnerships, and patience.
Okay, so let me see here. In the second row here.
Hello. A September 2024 article in The Atlantic reported that you pushed back against criticism of Israel's military tactics by referencing the U.S. siege of Mosul against ISIS during the Obama administration. Can you elaborate by what you meant by that comparison? And did this kind of policy dissent, whether it was from, as it reported in The Atlantic, individuals like Deputy National Security Advisor Jonathan Feiner or other outside groups, did that pressure meaningfully shape policy discussions at the highest level, or was it largely symbolic? Thank you.
Sorry, what did it say I said? I don't know.
It says that you pushed back against criticism of Israel's military tactics by referencing the U.S. siege of Mosul against ISIS under the Obama administration.
That would just be completely. One thing with working in Washington, stuff comes out. It's like I don't even know what that's referencing. But no, I would say I was there in Mosul. It was a battle, brutal. And if you went to West Mosul, the whole city was destroyed. We had voices sometimes early in the Gaza war saying, well, look what we did in Mosul. We had a big humanitarian plan, and as if it wasn't a brutal, horrible war. The point is, war is awful. But any idea that someone said, oh, look, that's just completely false. In Mosul, we had a massive humanitarian plan. We got 1 million civilians out of Mosul. It was a huge success. It was the greatest fusion of humanitarian and military operational coordination ever. And yet Western Mosul was completely destroyed. We got most civilians out, but the difficulty with Gaza is that civilians have nowhere to go and that the enemy is underground. It is an awful, awful war. So it's a very different thing to talk about the brutal nature of warfare in an urban environment versus defending attack. That's just a false characterization. But the difficulty about Gaza, the population has nowhere to go. And I have to be honest, even when the Israelis came to the UN early and said, we're going to make this part of Gaza a humanitarian zone, the UN said, no, we can't be a part of that. Because that would be, we would somehow then give an imprimatur to your military operation. Well, then where are people supposed to go? And so sorry, I don't know exactly what that was referencing, but no, it'll be a false characterization.
Professor Rosenfeld in the front row.
Thank you. So I have a question that's inspired by your comment that China's rising role in the Middle East really concerns you and calls for, you said, sort of a cold assessment of some pragmatism. And I guess I'll put this in a maybe intentionally provocative way, but I'm listening and I'm thinking, so are we really going to outflank China materially with purely transactional basis? Isn't it maybe the ideas, democracy among them, that are our comparative advantage? So I'm interested in your
Sure, it's a good
reactions.
question.
Yeah, thanks.
Good example. UAE today announced a $1.5 trillion investment here in our AI and everything else. Why are countries coming in our direction when it comes to AI? I think tomorrow there's a panel on AI. Because they think we're winning. And 2 years ago, when AI became like a strategic concept in the leadership meetings, which was not the case, I think, before 2022, there was a big question of where all those resources were going to go. I think it's very much in our interest to have them come here, be in our ecosystem. That's because of our example and because of our innovation base. And you're asking a very fair question. And I think it is partially our model, our values, that ultimately are attractive. But, I mean, there's a big question every 4 years in Washington of whether we should be in the Middle East at all or massively shift resources into the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's a huge mistake because, first of all, we're a global power. We can do many things at once. But I know what China's ambitions are in the Middle East region. They want military bases. They want technology partnerships. And it's in our interest to, our comparative advantage on that is we have such long-standing partnerships there that we want to strengthen. But that does not mean that we don't try to advance our value. We're the only country in the world, probably the only country in the world, if you're having a meeting in Cairo, on the agenda is human rights. Not the only country in the world, but one of the great powers in the world right now. We talk about human rights. We talk about values. At least we did in our administration, and got a lot of people out of prison. But still, the record is very much imperfect. So yeah, it's a fair question, and I don't want to suggest that we completely lose sight of what makes us special. But I do think there are really hard power equations. And that question of AI and investment in that sector is a critical one right now in this part of the world.
Back row here, and then okay. You guys.
Thank you. My question would be, since you mentioned sort of long-term American engagement, in terms of Gaza and the Gaza-Israeli conflict right now, what sort of long-term American engagement would you see as most productive towards like long-term American security goals and then long-term goals of peace between the two parties, if you see those things as differing?
I think an American role is critical. I think a very hard reality to this problem is something I mentioned briefly in the talk, but so long as Hamas is controlling Gaza, it imperils any option for a better future. You're not going to have international reconstruction. You're not going to have an interim security force. You're not going to have any hope of a political path between Israelis and Palestinians. And what I have found in being a part of these negotiations for some time is that Hamas is determined at the end of the day to stay in power. And they don't care at all about the Gazans at all. It's all about their narrative and staying in power. And I do believe there is a formula, however, and the way we tried to structure this deal is that by the end of that process where all the hostages are released and it's a massive also release of Palestinian prisoners, you can have a political formula where Hamas actually does relinquish power. You can have an interim force. The American military would not be in Gaza, but we would play an enabling role, probably based in Egypt. There are things we can do. I mean, it's all there. But so long as Hamas insists on remaining in power in Gaza, it is a fundamental obstacle to anything. And I wish there was more attention to that point. And the way Hamas presented itself during the hostage deal, coming out in full military uniforms, doing those grotesque displays, made that future much harder. That's just the reality of the, I'm kind of approaching this as like an analyst, as someone who also been dealt with it. Like, if Hamas's core goal is we're staying in power no matter what, don't care what happens in Gaza, don't care how many people die, there's like no future. And I've talked to the hostages who've come out, a number of them, and one of them told me that he's with his captors for 440 days. And not only did they not once display any ounce of concern, but they would watch, this is what he told me, they would watch the destruction of Gaza on Al Jazeera and laugh. Because in their narrative, this is like what they're actually after. And it's happening right now. The war, the ceasefire is broken down. I think there's a way to get back to it. It's with a hostage prisoner exchange. But immediately they're shifting into their narrative, and it's like that's what they care about. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but it is the obstacle to any hope here is that Hamas entrenchment and remaining in power. It doesn't mean Hamas is going to go away as a political movement, but their insistence on remaining in power as a military force in Gaza, so long as that happens after October 7th, there's like no path.
Question in the back from Clara, and then from
Hello. I know you said that you don't think that democracy promotion should be like a core feature of American foreign policy because it doesn't have the effects that we're intending. I was wondering if, putting that aside, you would say that it makes any difference to American security interests whether another country is a democracy or not. Thank you.
It's a hard question to answer, really, because, there's a theory that democracies do not attack democracies, but democracies also, Iraq was mentioned, and Dr. Shamari's point. A lot of policies of Iraq we don't like. They come out of a democratic process. So, no, I think in terms of our just national security, is whether a country is a democratic system or a different system, I don't think it necessarily correlates. We can have deep security ties and deep relations with a country that's not a democracy for its own reasons, or within a liberal democracy, like I think Turkey is still a NATO ally, but we have all sorts of problems with Turkey from time to time. And frankly, I've dealt with a lot of our democratic friends who can be very hard to deal with in one way or another. So it's an interesting question, but no, I don't think there's a direct correlation there.
Thank you. And a question here.
Hi, this is not going to take too long. I just wanted to clarify something that was possibly said in your speech and specifically in your bio about the defeat of ISIS. Do you genuinely believe that in this day and age, ISIS has and will be defeated?
Well, it was a caliph. It controlled. It controlled basically its own state, the size of Indiana, 8 million people. It controlled entire cities. It was spreading attacks into Europe, into Paris, into Brussels. I remember I was in Brussels airport the day after the bombing there. I was in Paris shortly after. Over 132 people were killed in the streets of Paris. That was all coming out of Syria. It's coming out of a town called Manbij. They controlled Mosul. I mean, so they were a state. Was that state entity defeated? Yes, no question. They do not control any territory. Is ISIS as an extreme idea still there? Of course. That whole camp was mentioned. This is a camp in which a number of ISIS former fighters and their families still are in this camp, and there's like no answer yet for where they're going to go. But the physical manifestation of what was a serious threat, not only to the region, Syrians, to Iraqis, but also to the world, yeah, that was defeated, and I think it was done as about effectively as we could have done it. But no, I mean, this is always do you defeat the idea? Extremist ideas are still there, and that's why battles of ideas still matter.
We have time for one more question from Yusuf Shahid.
Thank you very much. Maybe quick comment and question about the U.S. Pushing or promoting democracy in the MENA region. First, I think we can no longer talk about one single MENA region. I mean, there is big differences between oil and non-oil countries, and even within oil countries, you cannot compare UAE to Libya, for example, today. So I think there are big differences now, and we saw that with the Abraham Accord and the Arab Spring, etc., etc. And then, so the argument that if we push too much the governments for democracy, they will turn to Russia and China. I can understand that. But now we are living in a world where you cannot prevent countries to have relation in the West and in the East like before. Today, countries have relation here and there, not like before the Cold War. But then it is, at least for example for Tunisia and other countries, it is an argument used to blackmail the West. So if you push us too much, we'll go to China. Okay, go to China. Ask China to help you with the IMF, with the World Bank. So the world is still under the Western dominance. So then in the reality, China is helping to build the I don't know, the infrastructure or thing like that. But and here is the point. I think the strategy, if I may, needs to focus to the elite of the Arab world that studied in the US universities, that is Western oriented, that believe in the values, call it democracy or US values or of freedom of speech, etc. And today the risk is that the elite has start to have distrust with the West and the Western values. So I think the mass population, for the moment, they will never be pro-US or go to the street to fight for the US, unfortunately. But the elite is Westernized, is believing in US values or Western value, and the elite is crucial to maintain this relation of trust and to have long partnership with the elite. And it is the role of the elite in their country to educate their people for democracy or for this value. So maintaining this relation today, there is start to be distrust with the elite in the Arab world after all the recent events. So I have just a question about the argument you mentioned that dictatorship, authoritarian regimes finally or at the end help the rise of extremism, and this is what happened after September 11, etc. After September 11. Where we stand with these arguments today? Is it still the argument that you mentioned that was used in 2001 and explained maybe the invasion of Iraq? Where we stand today with this argument that authoritarian regimes are an open door for extremism?
I think the character, again, country by country is very important. So I don't think we should paint with a broad brush. That's critical, what you just said. But it's the character of the country, and then what is the prescription? So the prescription of invading the country and toppling the system I just think was probably flawed. But no, I look at Iran. I mean, Iran is a serious problem. And like I have negotiated with Iran, I've done deals with Iran, I've been involved in almost armed conflicts with Iranian proxy. I mean, I've seen it from all manifestations. And after October 7th, it wasn't a Gaza crisis. It was a regional crisis with a multi-front war that Iran was like stoking and enabling. And so like Iran, to me, is a serious problem. We should want that regime to change using various tools we have. That doesn't mean like a military invasion. But the idea that it's just lack of democracy per se that leads to these threats, I think that argument that as I said before, my experience in going to Iraq and seeing it up hand for 2 decades, I kind of found compelling after 9/11. I think that argument is flawed. You just have to be more sophisticated looking at it, and it's country by country. But Iran, I just want to leave it there. I mean, Iran is this year in Iran, just for if you're Middle East watchers, is a big year because we have the nuclear deal from the Obama years actually does come to an end in October because snapback ability to put sanctions back on. So you're either going to have a resolution to that by October, the nuclear crisis, or you're going to have a nuclear crisis. And it is coming fast. And so keep an eye on that.